But then, to be fair, I cannot recall any colleague who could paint a self-portrait with absolute honesty. However accurately one may fill in the surface details of one's mirror reflection, the personality represented rarely comes near to the truth as others would see it. And the personality that Ono represents of himself in this book also rarely comes close to the truth as others may see it. Hello, welcome back to It's Too Late to Apologize Book Reviews. I'm Stella, and today we're going to be talking about An Artist of the Floating World by Kazuo Ishiguro. An Artist of the Floating World was written by Kazuo Ishiguro, who was born in Japan but moved to the UK at age 5. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2017. This was his second novel, published in 1986, and it's my second Ishiguro novel, the first being The Remains of the Day. An Artist of the Floating World is a historical fiction about Japan after the Second World War. I'm going to be mindful to not give away any spoilers for this, so you can watch without worry. This story is about an artist named Masuji Ono, whose married daughter, Setsuko, and grandson, Ichiro, come to visit his prominent but traditional home he shares with his other unmarried daughter, Noriko. His youngest daughter, Noriko, has had a marriage proposal fall through, and now there is worry that a new marriage prospect will fall through also. This seems like a straightforward problem, except that the damage the war has done to their family, city, culture, and country seems subtle at first. But as the story progresses, we see the increasing shadow the war and the past casts over everything. Ono's traditional home is fractured and damaged from the random bombings. This building that is a relic of the old Japanese traditions and values. The youngest daughter, Noriko, is 26 and unmarried because the war interrupted the everyday fabric of life, and now the family is almost desperate to secure a future for her. The city is being rebuilt after the bombing, and the old buildings and activities left in ruin are mourned and remembered. And finally, the American occupation of Japan after the war has had a dramatic change of perception for those citizens who are left. The young, idealistic men who fought in the war are now angry and resentful veterans. Ono's grandson is captivated with the Lone Ranger instead of his own cultural relics. The story unfolds through Ono's reminiscings and languid memories of times before and after the war, and how his work as an artist has had influence in both positive and negative aspects for himself and for his family. And the reader may realize through Ono that there are many ways that one can waste one's life, especially when one is not being honest with themselves. This story is told from first-person perspective, which is my favorite way to receive a story. And in this perspective, we get the unreliable narrator through Ono. And he is so human and starts off so likable. And he charms us with his very Japanese style of politeness, subtlety, and self-depreciating sincerity that has you start out trusting him. But slowly you begin to doubt everything. You see that Ono is not always honest with the reader. And I'm not sure he can be honest with even himself, as he is trapped in his own perceptions of his career and the war itself. So reading this novel becomes this attempt at dissecting the impossible truth. Just as looking at an artist's painting, one can never be sure of what the artist was originally looking at, or even whether the results of their efforts were the original intentions at all. It's stated in the beginning that he has never known an artist to be able to portray themselves accurately in a self-portrait. No matter how skilled the artist is, there will always be inaccuracies in the likeness produced. It will either be flattering or overly disparaging in some way. So, from there on, we know that what we are about to read will at times be one or the other scenario. I have still in my possession a painting by the tortoise, a self-portrait he painted not long after the Takeda days. It shows a thin young man with spectacles sitting in his shirt sleeves in a cramped, shadowy room, surrounded by easels and rickety furniture, his face caught on one side by the light coming from the window. The earnestness and timidity written on the face are certainly true to the man I remember, and in this respect the tortoise has been remarkably honest. Looking at the portrait, you would probably take him to be the sort you could confidently elbow aside for an empty tram seat. But then, each of us, it seems, has his own special conceits. If the tortoise's modesty forbade him to disguise his timid nature, it did not prevent him attributing to himself a kind of lofty intellectual air, which I, for one, have no recollection of. But then, to be fair, I cannot recall any colleague who could paint a self-portrait with absolute honesty. However accurately one may fill in the surface details of one's mirror reflection, the personality represented rarely comes near to the truth as others would see it. And the personality that Ono represents of himself in this book also rarely comes close to the truth, as others may see it. We see Ono as a man who seems to consider his supposed high status in low regard. And we see him go out of his way to say that he didn't care about such meaningless things. He doesn't have a single one of his paintings hanging in his house, and at first we think this is his modesty or humble nature that has furnished his home with the artworks of his friends instead of his own. But then we discover it is shame and guilt that prevents him from displaying his art. That in fact, he cares very much about his status, especially because we come to see that he has lost it. This is the story of a man who rebelled against his father's wishes for himself, who rebelled against his first teacher who could not take him where he wanted to go with his career, who then rebels against his second teacher who stylistically could not support him with where he wanted to take his art. And all this seems explainable as he wishes to forge his own path, and everyone can understand such a desire. But when he rebels against society and becomes involved with the imperialist movement in Japan before the war, we as readers pump the brakes. He wanted his life's work to matter, to mean something. He wanted to be seen as a man who dedicated his life to a great thing. And all of us can understand such aspirations. But the naivety of youth often has us place our efforts in myopic, ill-conceived quests. And my God, is there no more pertinent a message that we all need to hear right now? God, I love this book, Ishiguro. We get this story through several vignettes and distorted memories that paint a perplexing perspective. At times, we know Ono is making himself look better than he was, and at times he minimizes what he was. And we get this confusion again from his daughters who know him best. The first daughter was married before the war and knows her father as a strict man. But we see the second daughter treat her father almost rudely at times, and we see that he is very passive, which shocks the older sister. The war has had a huge impact on this man who lost so much to it. Because as difficult as it may be to understand how much influence he had, he did have the ability to have people arrested. At first, we think we will see that there has been a misunderstanding, but through this scene, we come to understand how deeply he was entrenched in the propaganda machine. His students' paintings are burned, just as Ono's paintings had been burned by his father and by his teacher, and Ono indirectly does it to his student. Ono seems gracious at times and to be so sympathetic toward his teacher and father for burning his work, but he is setting up his own act as understandable. This is a manipulation of the reader. And even the sympathy and comments that Ono makes that there had been a mistake with the severity of the arrest made because of his informing, this sympathy is most likely because of Ono's post-war perspective and not the feelings he actually had at the time. We see that Ono disparages others looking to minimize their part in the war, but does the same thing himself when he tries to visit a former student. But the nugget of truth he supposedly says to the youth he encounters, who judges him, is no less true because of his hypocrisy. Ono says, "I finished lacing my shoes and started for the door. You're too young, Mr. Inichi, to know about this world and its complications." Yes, he was too young to understand, just as Ono was before the war. But we also see that Ono took pleasure in the thought that his former teacher had fallen out of regard and had to draw for comic books, which is seen as a lowly art form, which was the warning his teacher gave of his own future prospects if he left his studio. This really turns the reader's perspective of Ono into this unflattering, self-centered light. It was so well done and was so subtly, insidiously planted. And the name Masuji means, depending on how it's written in kanji, the benefit of a path or the benefit of growing up. And Ono, depending on how it's written, can mean a big field or a little one. And it's such a poetic name because the path or the growing of either into being a man in the larger scale of culture or the world, or a man in a smaller one? Which is the path? Which is this man's destiny? I absolutely love this novel. I know that might have been difficult to gather by the very guarded review. But I warn anyone picking up this novel that it is a slow-paced read. It is an unhurried, scattered, and distracting conversation you are having with this older man who is trying to come to terms with the impact of his choices. This is like sitting down with a grandparent and having them tell you a multitude of stories from their life. And it's through these stories that we get the self-portrait of Ono. But we know the subject matter is uglier and darker than portrayed. And where some might think that first-person perspective is limiting or too biased to tell the story truthfully, I would say that is exactly the point, and that is life precisely. And Ishiguro does it so masterfully that I'm awed by his brilliance. I watched an interview with the author, I'll link it down below, where the woman interviewing him started out with this quote: "There are 3 lies we live with. The lies we tell others, the lies we tell ourselves, and the lies we don't even know we are living." End quote. I could not find out who the original quote was by, but it was such an amazing epigraph to the interview and to this novel in general. I think another great epitaph would be, "The truth will set you free, but not until it's finished with you," by David Foster Wallace. I find it endlessly fascinating to consider how the character nicknamed the Tortoise is treated in Ono's memories. We get the impression that he is a slow artist that never finds his own style, and that is this very mediocre artist that will never amount to anything important. He was seen as a type of loser. But Ono defends the tortoise to the other artists in the studio, and even convinces the tortoise to come with him to a more prestigious studio and teacher. Now, why would Ono do that if the tortoise was so talentless? I think the answer is that the tortoise embodies what a real artist should be. The tortoise never sacrificed the quality of his work for the speed of the other artists at the studio. He contentedly stuck to the aesthetic he admired and never veered from it no matter what. He did not cave to Ono even though he admired him greatly. He neither followed nor stood in his friend's way when Ono's artistic subject matter changed. And one might say that he should have tried to stop him like Ono's teacher and father did when they burned his paintings. But in reality, that only added fuel to Ono's rebellious fire. And the tortoise goes on to become the teacher before and after the war. He is the one followed. It is perhaps he who embodies the artistic integrity that Ono lost. Ono says to the tortoise, "In my opinion," I said, "Master Takeda doesn't deserve the loyalty of the likes of you and me. Loyalty has to be earned. There's too much made of loyalty. All too often men talk of loyalty and follow blindly. I, for one, have no wish to lead my life like that." These, of course, may not have been the precise words I used that afternoon at the Tamagawa temple, for I have had cause to recount this particular scene many times before, and it is inevitable that with repeated telling, such accounts begin to take on a life of their own. But even if I did not express myself to the tortoise quite so succinctly that day, I think it can be assumed that those words I had just attributed to myself do represent accurately enough my attitude and resolve at that point in my life. And it's this following blindly that I feel it's what Ono does into the imperialist propaganda for Japan. But it's the tortoise who does not follow blindly. And you can see how Ono displays the scene and then questions whether he remembers it correctly, but then reassures us that it's close enough to how it actually happened. He's sure of it. He's sure of it. So good. And then this is another point where Ono looks to the tortoise while he was painting. I continued to regard my half-finished painting for a moment, and then glanced across to my friend over the ancient pot suspended between us. The tortoise was painting happily, unaware of my gaze. He had put on a little more flesh since the days I had first known him at Master Takeda's, and the harassed, fearful look of those days had been largely replaced by an air of childlike contentment. In fact, I recall someone around that time comparing the tortoise to a puppy who had just been petted, and indeed this description was not inappropriate to the impression I received as I watched him paint that afternoon in the old kitchen. "Tell me, tortoise," I said to him, "you're quite happy with your work at present, are you?" "Most happy, thank you, Ono-san," he replied immediately, Then glancing up, he added hastily with a grin, "Of course, it has a long way to go before it can stand alongside your work, Ono-san." His eyes returned to his painting, and I watched him working for a few more moments. Then I asked, "You don't consider sometimes trying some new approaches?" "New approaches, Ono-san?" he said, not looking up. "Tell me, Tortoise, don't you have ambitions to one day produce paintings of genuine importance? I don't mean simply the work that we may admire and praise amongst ourselves here at the villa. I refer to work of real importance, work that will be significant, work that will be a significant contribution to the people of our nation. It's to this end, Tortoise, I talk of the need for a new approach." I had watched him carefully as I said this, but the tortoise did not pause in his painting. "To tell you the truth, Ono-san," he said, "someone in my humble position is always trying new approaches. But over this past year, I believe I'm beginning to find the right path at last. You see, Ono-san, I've noticed Mori-san looking at my work more and more closely this past year. I know he is pleased with me. Who knows, sometime in the future, I may even be permitted to exhibit alongside yourself and Mori-san." Then at last he looked across to me and laughed self-consciously. "Forgive me, Ono-san. Just a fantasy to keep me persevering." I decided to let the matter drop. I had intended to try again at some later date to draw my friend into my confidence, but as it turned out, I was preempted by events. The tortoise is the true artist. This book also poses the question of what should art be? Should it be rooted in tradition? Should it be trying to blend international perceptions and style into it? Should it be made for those who are willing to pay for a pleasing composition that is cliché? Should art be propaganda? And what duty does an artist have for the repercussions and impacts of their work? What duty does the artist have to the future? This is a whole other video in itself.
You don't understand. It's so good. I have zero chill right now. Why did I bring the mic closer if I was going to whisper into it? I'll put it down now.
This book is about the idea that one could take what one believes to be well-placed idealism, which is usually naive and flawed as all idealism is, to find that the culture has changed and find that your idealism is wrong. Or perhaps you did not realize the eventuality of where your ideals would lead to, because that naivety and idealism fails to acknowledge reality and complexity sufficiently. To find that what you dedicated yourself to actually contributed to mass suffering and death is a hard pill to swallow. But also, how do you go on when you know other people know your involvement? The impact of the everyday, seemingly mundane choices in life are being examined here. That the everyday people in the process of just going to work and either supporting someone or firing someone or informing on someone matters. We like to see the problem as being the war criminals and the generals and the premiers and the presidents and the emperors. But no, it is all much more pedestrian than that. It is all of us. It is the idea that all of us not being able to understand how the larger political world hinges on the private civilian world. What you do, what all of us do, matters. And before you give yourself over to a cause, one must consider the widespread ramifications of a cause, as the effects are always more widespread and impactful than we think. If you don't see any cons to a particular position, you do not understand your position at all. But there is so much humanity in the way that Ishiguro tells this story. It's as if when we discover Ono's self-deception, he does too. He can admit his regret, and we can see public figures commit suicide as a manner of atonement for their hand in the war. And Ono's family come to recognize his own feelings of guilt, that we see this cultural anger and regret come to a head. We can also see the power of forgiveness withheld, but also granted. And that is what an artist of the floating world is trying to tell the reader. And it's a beautiful thing. For the lies we live will always be confessed in the stories we tell. Orson Scott Card. But what did you think? Did you like this book? Did you hate it? What do you think the artist's duty is to the future? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like and subscribe so that more people can join the discussion in the comments and find some great books. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.